Committee, and it's an informational hearing with the subcommittee on the Budget Subcommittee on Education with Senator Block, and I welcome all of you because we're going to talk about a subject matter that I know that is been around for several years, and I feel like I'm getting old with this particular topic, but it's accountability for post-secondary education performance. And before we get started, I really wanted to thank my staff, for those of you who, Kathleen especially, for my staff, those of you who received the packet for this after this morning's hearing have to be impressed with the amount of work that was done to put together this presentation today, and also would like to thank NCSL and Julie Bell for her participation in helping formulate and getting people here on our panel. So what we have, as I have stated, spent some time over the years trying to talk about higher education accountability and the importance of setting statewide goals and the potential metrics for this purpose. And so the good news is that we've made some progress. Last year, the governor did sign my legislation, SB 195, which established 3 broad statewide goals for higher education: improved student equity, access, and success; better aligned degrees and credentials with the state's economic workforce and civic needs; and the effective and efficient use of resources while maintaining quality and affordability. In addition, the governor's budget established performance measures, which included graduation and completion rates to be reported on by the UCs and CSUs annually. And this year's budget proposes a long-term spending plan for higher education and tasks the UCs and CSUs with developing 3-year sustainability plans and setting targets for the performance measures outlined in the statute. It also proposes support to the Chancellor's Office of the community colleges in order to develop system-wide and college-level goals. I support the direction in which our governor is heading, but I want to be sure that we develop a process and structure that ensures that we are focused on a public agenda for higher education, that the legislature's priorities are reflected in whatever targets and goals and sustainability plans may be developed, and that we create an accountability framework that is sustainable over the long term. So I look forward to working with the governor and our budget committees to meet these objectives. Today, we will hear more about the governor's proposals. We have speakers who will discuss our specific needs in relation to the statewide goals that we have adopted, and we'll hear about some of the efforts underway in other states to see what we can learn from their experiences. So Senator Block, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to, we're going to play tag team here, introducing the various panels. So Senator Block.
Thank you, Senator Liu, and I do want to thank Senator Liu and staff, all staff who helped to put this event together, and those who are visiting us from nearby and far away as well. This should be a very interesting session. As Senator Liu has said, she's done a lot of work in the field of accountability. The legislature has worked in this area, and yet we don't seem to be where we need to be. The most important thing, I think, in identifying the need has been that I think nationally now there is an awareness we need to do more in higher education. The President in his State of the Union speech, both this year and last year, talked about a skills gap and the need for us in California and throughout the United States to meet the skills gap and prepare our students for the workforce. The governor in his State of the Union speech talked about the same thing and has talked since about quality education, but doing it with less expense and more efficiency if possible. So we know the need is there. Our goal is laid out, I think, in California by California Competes, by PPIC. They tell us that we need between 60 and 100,000 more bachelor's degrees produced every year from now to 2025. Now that's really an awesome task to try to accomplish within our current budget constraints. I think our objectives are clear. We need to, in order to reach that goal of producing these many more bachelor's degree awardees, recipients each year, We need to decrease the time to graduation so that we can get one group in and out and another group in. So with the same facilities, the same faculty, we can still have more people put through the system to graduate. We need to raise the graduation rate so that those who are there don't just waste taxpayer dollars. They get in, they get their degree. And we need to reduce the cost of graduation if possible, so students aren't taking extra units they don't really need. That's part of this one objective for this goal. Students shouldn't be graduating with an extra 30 or 40 units. That's really a waste of time, a waste of space, and a waste of the state's dollars. At the same time, we need to increase the raw number of students who graduate. We need a better pipeline, and that means more diversity. We can't improve our graduation rates at the expense of being less diverse. We need more students in the pipeline working toward the bachelor's degree, and in California, those numbers mean more Latino students, more students of color. So we need to do a better job with diversity and seeing that even students at risk, who may be the most needy in some cases, succeed. Lastly, we need to make sure we are placing students in positions for which they're studying. It doesn't do us any good to produce 60,000 more bachelor's degree students whose skills don't match the jobs that are out there. So we need to work more closely with the workforce. So if we meet all of those objectives, and that's not an easy task, we can be on track to satisfy the president and the governor in their cry for a better workforce and a skills gap that is reduced. The way we do that, I think, is through accountability. And when I say accountability, I mean we motivate by rewarding schools that are successful, by rewarding students who are successful, and perhaps there are negative consequences for those who don't meet these objectives. With that, we're going to hear from panelists who bring a lot more knowledge to this than I do. So I'm looking forward to hearing their expertise. And with that, I'll ask if any of my colleagues, I see Senator Lonnie Hancock is here. Senator Hancock, do you have any comments?
Looking forward to the discussion as well.
Okay. We'll move on to the first panel. And the first panel is from the Department of Finance, we have Molly Quaisbarton, Principal Program Budget Analyst, and from the LAO's office, the Legislative Analyst's Office, Paul Galasuski, Principal Fiscal and Policy Analyst. Please come forward. And Ms. Quaisbarth, would you begin by giving us a Department of Finance overview of the current budget proposal as it relates to performance and goals?
Good morning, Senators Lieu and Bach. My remarks today will focus on those specific proposals in the governor's budget that address student outcomes and performance goals for the state's higher education institutions. For UC and CSU, the administration's proposal continues to reinvest in the four-year universities according to the long-term funding plan that was adopted in the 2013 Budget Act to provide modest and predictable funding increases for UC and CSU through 2016-17, contingent on the universities holding tuition flat at 2011-12 levels. Both UC and CSU will receive general fund increases of $142 million this year, with the expectation that the segments focus on improving critical outcomes, specifically aligned with those Senator Block just mentioned, maintaining affordability, decreasing the time it takes students to complete their degrees, increasing the number of students who complete their academic programs, and easing the transfer of community college students to UC and CSU. A new proposal in this year's budget requires the governing boards of UC and CSU to adopt three-year sustainability plans by November of 2014, showing how they will align their expected resources with expenditures in 2015-16, 16-17, and 17-18. These projections will reflect the available core fund resources, including state general fund and tuition and fee revenues, based on assumptions that the Department of Finance will provide. The three-year plans will illustrate how the segments will spend these resources and describe any significant program changes that will be necessary to live within these resources projected. The segments will provide estimates for both resident and non-resident enrollments on which these sustainability plans are based. And finally, reflecting a critical component of these plans, the universities will set goals for each of the performance measures they will begin reporting on this March as required under AB 94 as part of the 2013 Budget Act. These include the number and proportion of transfer students and low-income students, graduation rates for both freshmen and transfer students, degree completions, a short-term measure to indicate the likelihood that students will graduate on time, and this is the percentage of first-year students who have completed a significant number of course credits to indicate they will be able to graduate within 4 years. The cost per degree, the average number of courses completed by students when they graduate, and the number of degree completions in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields. The administration decided not to pursue its proposal from last year's governor's budget that set performance targets tied to the university's state budgets, due in part to feedback that was received from stakeholders meetings Department of Finance coordinated over the summer, which included various parties that had lots of interest in the state's goals for higher education, in which strong opposition was voiced against providing or going forward with some kind of performance methodology. The administration expects the university to set aggressive yet achievable outcome goals for each of the measures in these sustainability plans, and to use the general fund increases provided in the long-term funding plan to show improvements toward achieving these goals. The community colleges will receive $6.7 billion in Proposition 98 general fund and property tax revenues in 14-15, which is an increase of about $500 million from last year. There are two new proposals in the budget that focus on setting performance goals and improving student outcomes for the community colleges. The budget provides $1.1 million in general fund and 9 positions to strengthen the role of the Chancellor's office. They will establish system-wide state goals for the community colleges, develop leading indicators of student success at the 112 colleges, which allow them to get a better sense of how the students are doing in a shorter time frame rather than just looking at graduation rates or whatever, which kind of doesn't provide the short-term feedback to make changes. And then the Chancellor's office will monitor the individual college's performance. To help the colleges improve on these outcomes, the budget provides $2.5 million in local technical assistance to disseminate best practices across all of the colleges, and the focus on this coming year will be for the technical assistance to go to the most underperforming colleges. The second proposal, aimed at increasing students' performance at the community colleges, provides $200 million to expand activities of the Student Success Initiative to build upon the recommendations made by the Student Success Task Force convened in 2012. The recommendations included measures to improve student outcomes in the following areas: completion of basic skills and English as a second language courses, student persistence and retention, and successful transfer to 4-year colleges. $100 million will be used to expand the level of services currently being provided under the Student Success programs for all matriculated students. And these include activities such as orientation, assessments, course placement, counseling, and education plans. The second $100 million is targeted to close gaps in both access and educational achievement by underrepresented student groups, as identified by each college's student equity plan. The colleges are expected to better coordinate their existing categorical programs to ensure that the funds are being targeted and used to meet the needs of local student populations. To clear up some misconceptions that have come to light regarding how this $100 million, the second pot, can be used, the colleges typically have certain activities that they can use these funds for under the student success, which are those I mentioned above, the orientation, counseling, education plans. This $100 million, we've put language in that they can also use this for activities that are outside of that. So if they wanted to hire new faculty, redesign courses, do more office hours, whatever kind of they feel like would help to improve student success, they can use this money for that purpose as well. And also, rather than increasing funding for specific categorical programs that serve underrepresented students, such as disabled students, equal opportunity programs, basic skills, and CalWORKs, the budget provides this $100 million that each college can use. They can add to those categoricals or whatever, but they can use it to kind of look at where their student populations are, what is the greatest need they have at their college, and they can provide funding for that. So we felt like rather than increasing the funding for EOPS or CalWORKs or whatever, it's better to provide a broad pot of money and let each college decide where it best needs that. So in summary, the governor's budget proposals reflect the administration's clear expectation that the segments will use the additional resources being provided to focus on improving student outcomes and performance. This is consistent with the 3 state goals specified in Senator Liu's bill that was enacted last year. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from the LAO, Mr. Goluszewski.
Thanks. Paul Goluszewski with the Legislative Analyst's Office. I have prepared a handout that the sergeant should be distributing to you or already have distributed to you, from which I'll be speaking today. My presentation, first I'll start by going over the state goals that were enacted last year. Then I'll talk about performance measures that the state already has in place for the different segments. And then I'll go into how the issues that the state needs to work on to bring it all together. After that, I'll provide our assessment of the governor's proposals that the Department of Finance just presented. So the first page of the handout has the state goals for higher education that Senator Liu discussed in her introductory remarks. I won't go over it in too much detail. Maybe if you skip down to the last point. After establishing the goals, the legislation said that it was the legislature's intent for metrics to be developed to monitor progress towards these goals. It said there should be between 6 and 12 metrics using publicly available data, that the metrics should take into account the different missions of the different segments of public higher education in California, that the metrics should be disaggregated by different demographic categories when applicable, and that the metrics should take into account recently enacted performance metrics for UC and CSU and also for Cal Grants. So if you turn to the next page of the handout, I'll talk about the performance measures that have already been established for UC and CSU. These were added as part of the 13-14 budget package last year. The governor had proposed the list of metrics that you see in the table. The legislature had made a couple of modifications to the metrics proposed by the governor, and then all of them were put in statute, and the universities are required to start reporting on these metrics beginning March 1st, just a couple of days from now, and each year thereafter. And the measures are intended to guide budget decisions. As Ms. Quaisbarth mentioned, the governor had originally proposed a funding formula, but he later retracted that. So now the plan at the moment is for these measures just to be used more generally for informational purposes, not specifically linked with funding. The performance measures are at the system-wide level, not by campus, which is how we've generally budgeted for the universities in the past. And if you look at the measures, I won't go through all of them since Ms. Quaisbarth went through them in her presentation, but I think the way that you can think about them is it's trying to get at a couple of different things here. So the first two categories, transfers and low-income students, are about particular types of students that the state traditionally has cared about and tracking those. The next two, graduation rates and degree completions, are really outcome measures. How many degrees are the universities producing, and are students graduating within 4 or 6 years? How many students? The next one is an intermediate measure, so that's trying to get at sort of a more immediate measure of progress instead of, since you would have to track graduation rates over 4 or 6 years and it can take time to affect changes, the first-year students on track to degree measure is intended to try to get at immediate progress that can be made. The next two, funding per degree and units per degree, are pertain to efficiency measures in terms of spending and educational efficiency with the units measure. And the last degree, which was added by the legislature, is trying to address state workforce needs by looking at degrees in particular fields. If you go to the next page of the handout, page 3, I'll talk about performance measures that are in place for the community colleges at the moment. The community colleges have a student success scorecard. The scorecard resulted from a student success task force that was created by the legislature a few years ago. The community colleges are required to present scorecard results to their local governing boards for review. And they're also published on the Chancellor's Office website. But similar to the performance measures for UC and CSU, they're not specifically linked with funding or anything like that at this time. The community college measures fall into similar categories as the ones for the universities. There's some intermediate measures regarding persistence, some completion measures, as well as disaggregating by different types of students, similar to the universities. If you go to the next page of the handout, I'll talk about some performance measures that are in place for institutions that receive state Cal Grant awards. Cal Grants are the state's financial aid program. Both public and private institutions can receive funding from students through Cal Grants. These are added as part of the 11-12 budget package. And there's really two sort of components of Cal Grants performance. The first is eligibility to receive Cal Grants. So in 11-12, the state made a policy change that only institutions with default rates on student loans that institutions with default rates on student loans that exceed 15.5% and whose graduation rates are below 30% may not participate in Cal Grants. So this is a bit different than some of the performance that we've done for community colleges or UC and CSU, in that there's a direct consequence. Institutions cannot participate in the program if they don't meet these criteria. In addition, there's some reporting requirements for Cal Grants, so you see at the second bullet. They're somewhat similar to the ones for community colleges and UC and CSU. There's some intermediate reporting on persistence, there's some completion reporting, there's some reporting on vocational programs, job placement and earnings to try to get at workforce issues. You go to the next page of the handout, the fifth page. These are issues that we think the state needs to consider to try and bring these various performance measures together to create an accountability system. So the first issue to address is developing the metrics for SB 195. So we have metrics for each of the segments. Now we establish statewide goals, and we need statewide metrics. And the first question is, how are these metrics going to be developed? A previous version of Senator Liu's legislation had called for a work group with different stakeholders to establish the metrics. That version of the legislation had been vetoed, and the legislation that passed didn't establish a work group. So the first question would be, how are the metrics going to be developed? Experience from other states suggests that having a broad stakeholder group is usually a good approach to doing it. Second question is, how are these measures going to relate to the measures that we already have in place? Are they going to be separate measures? Are they going to be similar? Are they going to be different? I think our advice would be that the measures obviously should be in sync with one another. They don't have to be exactly the same necessarily. There could be reasons to have different measures for the institutions versus at the statewide level, but they should go together as a performance system. The third question is, who's going to track the statewide metrics? So right now, UC and CSU are tracking their measures, community colleges are tracking their measures, but at the statewide level, the state no longer has a coordinating body for higher education. So one outstanding question is, who would put all of this information together and track it? And who would ensure that there's consistency in reporting across segments to make sure that segments are defining different metrics in a similar manner so that you could compare them? The second question is, once you have the metrics developed, how are you going to set performance targets? And this applies to the measures we already have in place for UC and CSU, for which we don't have targets at the moment. Again, the first question is, who's going to set the targets? As you heard from the Department of Finance presentation, the governor's plan is to allow the segments to set targets as part of the sustainability plans, but we believe that the state should have some involvement in establishing the targets for performance. And then once you've answered that question, another one is, how are the performance measures, how are the targets going to be established? And there's a couple of different ways that you could go about it, and you're going to hear from panelists later today who can offer you some advice from the national level and from other states. You could look at past performance to set your targets. You could look at the performance of peer institutions, or you could, as Senator Block was saying, look at what you think the state needs and set your targets according to that. A couple of different approaches that you could use here. Then after you've set the targets, the next question is, how are you going to use this information to make budget and policy decisions? A couple of things to think about is whether or not all targets and all performance measures are equally valuable, whether you want to prioritize some over others. Whether all of them are equally under the control of the institutions. There could be some external factors that hamper the ability of the institutions to perform in certain areas that may not be directly under their control. Another question is, how exactly are you going to use the information to make your budget decisions? Will you use some sort of funding formula? Are you going to use the information more generally to allocate state resources? And are you going to make these decisions at the segment or the campus level? And the last issue we think that you should consider is accountability. This addresses, what do you do if institutions are not performing to your expectations that you have set? Do you increase funding? Maybe they're not performing because they lack resources to do something. Do you decrease funding? Maybe they're not spending efficiently and you want to provide, whether you go with the carrot or the stick approach. Do you become more prescriptive in terms of how the state spends money, in terms of putting more strings on state spending? Or do you intervene in institutional operations? The governor has some proposals that address this a little bit with the community colleges and technical assistance. So that's our overall advice for, or to try to set the stage for the panelists later today of the challenges that you're going to confront in trying to put in place this performance system. The next page, page 7 of our handout, had the summary of the governor's proposals. The Department of Finance just presented those, so I'll skip over it and go to our assessment, which is on page 8. I'll keep it at a very high level. Our understanding is these proposals are going to be discussed in much more detail in budget subcommittee in the next few months when we'll have more specific comments. But our overall reaction to the governor's plan is we think that the multi-year funding plan that the governor has lacks prioritizing state funding for different purposes. The only criteria that the governor attaches to providing money to the universities is to not increase tuition. There's no other specific expectations. Funding's not linked with specific cost increases. It's not linked with enrollment or anything else. And we think that this just is not a very rational way to budget for the universities. And we would recommend that you take a different approach. On the sustainability plans, as I mentioned earlier, I think our concern is that the sustainability plans would allow the segments to set the performance targets, and we think that the state should be involved with those. On the community college proposals that Ms. Quisbarth mentioned, we think that these generally have some merit, but that they could be improved. We think that for the proposal to set performance expectations and provide some technical assistance, we're not sure if additional funding is really necessary for these purposes, but we think it's generally a reasonable idea. And for the proposal to increase funding for student support services, we think that also has merit, but we would recommend providing even more flexibility than the governor's proposal to allow community colleges to address student success. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Galzewski. Senator Liu, questions?
After your presentation, what do you think about comparing the governor's proposal with SB 195? Do you think it comes? Is it moving toward achieving these stated outcomes that we at least agreed on? And he agreed too, because he signed the bill. But do you think?
Right.
I think we're moving that way.
Right. It's moving toward that direction. I think some of the concerns we have, as I was mentioning, is we think that the state should be involved more in setting metrics and targets for the universities, and more work still needs to be done to develop these statewide metrics to go along with the goals that we have in place.
Does it beg the question about having, another CPEC-like organization to help us do this, or do you think the legislature is capable of, and staff is capable of doing it by ourselves?
Yeah, the question of creating a replacement to CPEC raises a lot of other issues as well. In this particular area, it may have been helpful to have a coordinating body to guide the discussions and bring stakeholders together and develop the metrics. Though without CPEC, I think the legislature still could move forward. It's going to require more leadership, for example, maybe from the administration for the coordination. In terms of just bringing folks together, but having representation from the legislature, the segments as well.